And for more, we're joined by Hugh Lovatt, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24. As we just saw there, this is the worst violence along the border of Israel and Lebanon in 17 years. What are the chances we will see this escalate, specifically with regard to groups in Lebanon?
There's always a high risk of escalation leading to war. However, I think there is perhaps some good news, which is this current round of confrontation, of escalation, seems to have drawn to an end. And I think in some ways this was actually quite performative. So we think it was Palestinian factions who initiated the initial rocket fires. They wanted to be seen to be retaliating against Israeli repression of Muslim worshippers in Al-Aqsa. And likewise, Israel wanted to be seen to be retaliating against those rocket fires. But neither the Palestinian factions nor Hezbollah, that likely greenlit that rocket fire, nor Israel is actually really interested in a full-scale conflict. So that's the positive, but there's always the risk of uncalculated escalation.
You mentioned there the Al-Aqsa mosque, and comments before launching the strikes in Lebanon and Gaza. Netanyahu said, "We have no interest in changing the status quo on Temple Mount," which is how Israel refers to the mosque compound. Can you just give us some context to explain why the holy site is such a flashpoint in this conflict?
Certainly. So for Jews, the Temple Mount is the most sacred site. For Muslims, it's also extremely sacred. And so you have obviously both religions, both sides taking a claim to it. However, up until recently, the Israeli authorities and Israeli rabbis precluded or banned Jews from ascending the Temple Mount to worship. There's been a trend over the last few years by a group called the Temple Mount activists to try to change this, to bring back Jews to worship on the Mount. And this is seen as undermining this historical status quo where only Muslims pray on the Mount, Jews pray at the Wailing Wall. But I think, just to add, it's not just about this kind of status quo. I mean, on the ground, this is already starting to erode. And in addition, over the last few evenings, we've actually seen Israeli police entering the compound and repressing Muslim worshippers. And so images and videos of that violence is doing a lot to fan tensions and to fan escalation, both on the northern border, but also elsewhere amongst Palestinians in Israel, in Gaza, and also the West Bank.
Well, so Israel has its most extreme right and religious government in history. Of course, there's been a big backlash against Netanyahu's plans to reform the courts. But what role do you see this government playing from a security perspective, and whether tensions continue to rise?
Mm-hmm. So from my perspective, most of the Israeli actions and policies that have been pursued towards Palestinians, especially with regards to East Jerusalem and the West Bank, have been a continuity of the policies and actions we've seen previous governments, whether they were on the left or the center or the right, pursue. So there really hasn't been too much change in terms of the form. However, with this far-right government, what is happening is they're much more zealous, if you could use that word, or they're much more hard line in terms of how they're implementing these policies. And so I think that more hard line settlement policy, more hard line approach to Muslim worship on the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount is further exasperating tensions and further driving escalation. And I think the real story, we're talking about escalation on the northern border with Lebanon, but the real story, I think, is still the West Bank. And we had another shooting attack 2 hours ago in which 2 Israeli settlers died. And this is a sad reality that we've been seeing for the last year. And last year was the most bloodiest year for Palestinians in terms of the most Palestinians who were killed in the territories since the end of the Second Intifada in 2005. So that this escalation will continue regardless of what happens between Israel and Lebanon.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Hugh Lovatt, a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24.